welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the first session of the seminar series, which we hope will become a mainstay for research that we're all interested in. It's also, I think it's a nice way to like regularly converge in a virtual place to hear interesting research and have some interesting discussion. And with that, Danny will be the moderator tonight, and we're very pleased to have Hemant as our first speaker.
Yes, so let me just lay down some ground rules. And also, Andre, just to build on what you said, not only is it great to have people, the focus really for time zones here was to go through something differentiated, that there's not something that really is America's and APEC focused, and we wanted to fill that void. We wanted to do so in a way that brought together related fields, sometimes in the same building, where people don't always talk to each other. And we thought that there's a lot of value in talking across disciplines. So we have a scientific committee that incorporates many people from across different disciplines. And we look forward to having not just this as a standalone series, but as a way to better integrate learning from across fields on related topics. So because this is the first presentation, we're going to do something both similar and different from all subsequent presentations. So similar, we're going to have somebody doing really cutting edge work that we think is really interesting. So today we have Hemant Bhargava from UC Davis's Business School in Information Systems. He's a well-known theorist to so many of us. He's also one of the editors of Management Science on the IS side. So suck up to him by asking really helpful questions. But more importantly, what I like about this paper that makes it different is it's not every subsequent talk will be a full-on paper. This is actually a different kind of presentation, focusing on something early stage that is both new and yet distinctive and borrowed at the same time. And I'll let him go into detail about this. Let me set the ground rules that will be the same at every single session. Number one, we're going to do this more econ style in the sense that he gets 20 minutes. The first set of interruptions will only be for points of clarification. If you want to look good and show off, normally we wait for after the 20 minutes of presentation to do that. And we really want very active Q&A. And if we don't get enough Q&A, I'm going to start calling on people. So you really want active Q&A. But number two, and this is really, really important, feel free also if there's related stuff that you can't wait, we have a chat function, use it. And we can have side conversations at the same time. But with that, Hemant, I'm going to start with you. Give us a flavor of what you're working on and why we should all be captivated by it. The time begins now.
All right. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Andrea and Marshall and whoever else is here. And, wonderful to have people from Asia and the US. And particularly for me, it's great that we are doing this at 5 p.m. and not at 5 a.m., unlike one of the earlier series. So anyway, this talk, like Danny said, it's actually a mix of old, as in recent published work, but with a very new perspective and goal in mind, right? And the goal is to start thinking about how to analyze platform regulation. And it's a topic that I think all of you will have some reasons to believe it's an important topic. And today I'm not going to so much as analyze particular platform regulations and tell you what happens, or they're good or bad, but rather I'm trying to give you a framework, a modeling framework, which can be used to think about platform regulation. And in fact, I'm hoping that this framework will not be sufficient and complete. I'm hoping that it sets the foundation for others to start taking it and adding the bells and whistles needed to extend it to particular questions, right? So I want to think of this as a framework to model like the mechanics of a platform ecosystem, all right? So let me just dive right into this because now the time clock is ticking. I've been doing this like many of you, teaching a course in platform economics, connecting with people in industry, and of course, all our academic colleagues. And what's fascinating to me is in I think a very short span of 20 years, in this field of platform economics, strategy, and so on, we have moved so rapidly from the sense that platforms are exceptional, some really unique way to do business, to of course, we saw their triumph in every respect: financial, stock market value, market reach, impact on our lives, and so forth. And then all of a sudden to resentment at their overwhelming success and maybe power and potentially abuse of power. And all of this has happened in these 20 years. And now, of course, the most recent thing is indeed this concern about the power of platforms and numerous calls to action to do something about them, place constraints, make regulations, there are lawsuits, all of those. So in these, especially I think 5 to 7 years, especially since it got so much in the political arena, many of us have been talking about this, right? That there is a problem, what might we do about it, or commenting on, making opinions on others' calls for doing something about platform power. Many of us get onto TV shows, radio interviews, we write blogs. And as I did some of this and interacted with others doing the same, one feeling in my head was, okay, we know a lot about how systems function, economic systems, but we know platforms, due to network effects, are indeed different. And when we comment on potential effects of regulations, do we really know enough about being able to not have a crystal ball, but make reasonable predictions about what certain actions, regulations would do, right? So that was my goal in today's talk. And I'm going to weave in a couple of papers that were published. Both of them had different objectives. They were not about platform regulation. But I think the framework that I set to address those two papers does apply here. And then I'll maybe talk about the third one where we did apply the framework to examine a very specific issue, all right? So I said, the main question then for these 20 minutes is really how do we think about platform ecosystems, the mechanics of the ecosystem and the effect of regulations or other constraints. And the way I might frame it is, so the box on the right, the ecosystem, and I think you all understand what platform ecosystems mean. We mean the platform and all the participants that the platform brings in on different sides of it, right? Producers, customers, and so forth. So we want to understand some metrics about the ecosystem performance, and you can think of that in terms of scale, size, profits, etc. We look at all of those to some extent, and the economic payoff to different participants in this platform ecosystem. And the mechanics, the forces are, well, market attributes are going to affect it. Certainly the nature of these ecosystem participants, in particular the producers. And of course, the platform will make its own design and strategic choices. And so all of these things will interact to then determine the shape of these outcomes, right? But more interestingly, as we think about market rules and constraints, regulations, other inhibitions on platforms, we want to understand what are those consequences, keeping in mind that any changes to these rules will, of course, then change the platform's payoff, causing it to revise its own strategic and other design elements. And in fact, even though in this picture I've drawn the market attributes and characteristics of platform participants as sort of exogenous, I'm going to argue that platform design itself can alter the characteristics of the market and platforms, right? And I'll show you one or two examples of that. And so what we want to do ideally is to know that as we tweak something and then given all of these other interactions and forces that are exerted on this system, what might the outcomes look like, all right? So that's the framework I want to give. Lay out the framework, not too many answers. Anyway, this is supposed to be work in progress. So that part of it is work in progress. So what I primarily want to do in the beginning is to lay out these mechanics and maybe give you a few insights. And I hope that will fall in within my 20 minutes. And then one of the applications is to look at this area of differential revenue sharing that occurred last year in the two big, some of the big platforms, including iOS and Play Store. And then if I have a few minutes at the end, I would love to talk about the most recent work I'm doing, which is a little bit disconnected, but I hope the thread will come eventually, on digital addiction. All right. So Danny, how much more time do I have?
You've got plenty of time. We started at 5:05 and it's only 5:11.
Excellent. All right. So we all know there are many, many types of platform businesses, and they of course differ on what the sites in the platform are, but in particular, they differ on the nature of the business model. and maybe even how they do revenue sharing, right? And what I want to do ideally is have this framework that applies to all kinds of platforms. I will make a distinction though between business models that involve direct fees from customers, and so there are some, and others that involve indirect payments, meaning you're paying in your eyeballs or data and other things. And I think these two are different enough that they warrant slightly different attention, but I would like to show you that the framework works for both of those. And then, other variations can hopefully be covered by that. So there are four key elements in this conceptual framework. The first is, okay, since I want to cover so many different types of platforms, I will work with a very high level abstraction of ultimately what the platform brings to the market, especially to its demand side or customers. We'll call these value units. If it's YouTube, it could be a video. On Airbnb, it might be a room or a house. And we'll measure them, right? And I'll denote that as Q. And this is the aggregate of all the outputs or inputs that come in from various producers or complementers on the platform. And the point of this is to say that the demand for the platform from the user side is dependent on the value units it can bring together, right? So we'll call that D of Q. And maybe there is a price, or more generally think of it as a tax that is imposed on the customers of the platform. So the demand and the fact that there is some monetization scheme will lead to some surplus that the platform generates. And this is what I call the shareable surplus, meaning something it can produce or generate and keep some for itself and then share with producers in order to motivate them to share products or outputs with the platform. So we'll call this revenue sharing approach index it with a parameter gamma, which is to indicate that the platform gives the share gamma, for instance, 70% to producers and keeps the remaining 1 minus gamma to itself. And so this revenue sharing process creates profits or revenue for the producers, based on which they get motivated to produce outputs or what becomes inputs into this platform's offerings to the customers. And so I'll think of producer or creator or complementer I as choosing output QI, which will be a function of how much revenue they get from the platform and their cost or capabilities to generate value units to the platform, all right? And then if you put all of this together, obviously the market outcome, meaning the customer demand and everything else that flows, depends on the Qs, the QIs, and maybe other platform decisions, such as the price or the tax that it imposes. And then the revenue going back to complementers determines what they choose to offer. And all of this might be determined by some high-level design, contract, economic or technical design chosen by the platform. And I will give you 1 or 2 illustrations. If not right now, then maybe in the Q&A we can cover what that really means. Okay, so getting back to these 4 elements. So we'll think of Q as these value units, which are a summation, basically a single additive aggregation of all the inputs from different complementers. And this is something I thought very hard about. I don't think we'll have covered it too much here. But this Q, this bundle, this aggregate can contain complements, substitutes, very different things. So instance, in Uber, the varieties really, it's all the aggregation of rides, cars that are available. In an app store, it might be apps that do very different things, right? So some of those apps are complementary, some might be independent with each other, some could even be substitutes. You could have 7 different tools to do PDF annotation, for instance. You throw all of that together, that becomes the Q. So, and then the point about platforms is that platforms, the way they bring things together, they create demand due to variety and flexibility, not just due to quantity of what they offer, right? So given that the Q is an additive aggregation, I will adjust the way demand responds to Q by saying that it's less than linear, all right? So that's one key element of what do these value units really mean? The second is that, okay, and these are very basic ideas, that as the value units or the aggregation increases, demand increases, but maybe with diminishing returns. Obviously, demand is downward sloping in price, and both of these things come together to place some constraints on what the shareable surplus looks like, right? And these are very, very trivial assumptions. Then, as I said, the platform returns revenue share gamma to complementers. And I will think of complementers as being distinguished by their capabilities for generating value units, right? And I love looking at entertainments. For instance, if the complementers are producers of content, it could be the intellectual property rights they have, the star talent they have signed up, maybe technologies for production and animation, special effects. All of these things would be high capabilities, meaning that things produced by such creators would generate huge demand. They would be highly popular. And in my model, I think of that, I invert that into a cost of capturing one value unit or generating demand on the platform, right? So I'll think of C sub I as the unit cost of getting one value unit. And again, I'll think of it as a linear cost function. So CI times QI, because I have taken care of concavity in the demand side, all right? So all of these producers have different CIs, and the platform gives them collectively a surplus gamma, and each producer then gets a share of gamma times QI divided by Q, which is their fraction of, or their contribution to this overall surplus that is created by the platform, right? So this gamma or times QI over Q times the surplus is the revenue. There is a cost of making content, and all producers are looking to maximize their profit, right? And this is essentially resolved as a Cournot game where all producers simultaneously choose how much effort, time, cost they will put into contributing to the platform, right? And the platform, of course, has its own profit function. Now, something to keep in mind as we think ahead of regulation, for instance, platforms might choose to make their own content or products like Amazon does with Basics. And if that is the case, you can think of the platform having its own C sub I, but then also having a profit function that coordinates its marketplace profit, perhaps with product profit. And if you were to rule that out, then again, you can throw that into the model and see what the consequences of that might be. All right. So finally, then we can take this very basic architecture and compute the equilibrium, right? Which is the tax or the consumer tax that the customer or the platform might set, demand, surplus, profits to all participants, the scale of the platform in terms of total value units, and so forth. So I'm going to give you two slight variations of this because this architecture alone produces some insights, and that's in the two papers that I'll mention in just a few minutes. But then to get more, we need a little more detail in this model. So I'm going to take, as I said, these two different monetization models, direct and indirect. I'm going to start with a direct monetization model where let's say you have something like Gym Pass that imposes a monthly fee for you to get access to a whole variety of gyms, right? And these could be cycle classes, yoga, CrossFit, and so forth, right? That's the complement, substitutes, and so forth. So I've done a lot of work in bundling in the past and computing bundle demand when you have correlations, substitutes, complements, etc. gets on the one hand very difficult, but when you do a large number of items in the bundle, we also know in general that it starts assuming a particular shape. And in this picture that I have over here, I don't know if you can all notice, and I don't think my cursor is, it is working, yeah. So this is the shape of bundle demand, which is basically that it's getting flat in the middle, right? And we know from bundle theory that typically optimal bundle prices, meaning this price that the platform sets as a subscription fee, ends up in a region where you have high volume and relatively low margin, and not in this other region where you have high price and low volume. And because of that knowledge, I can actually replace this general shape of a bundle demand function with this approximate shape shown by the dashed line, all right? And so that works. There's no harm from this approximation. And once you do that, actually that in this paper that is mentioned out here on the left, I did a lot of work to show that this demand function that I show you on the right works really well. And you can see as this animation works as this theta parameter, which is really sort of the market need for variety in the platform's value unit. So as the need for variety increases, you can see how the demand function changes with the number of value units that the platform brings together, all right? So that's the one addition for direct monetization models. And the second one is if I turn to monetization models that are based on advertising or attention or perhaps data. The idea here is that now you have creators that make content and that brings in viewers. And viewers are again attracted by the content. This alpha of Q is the viewer response function, but they do not like advertising, right? So the presence of viewers brings in advertising. There is a distaste parameter delta. So viewership decreases if you have too many ads. And then the other thing to add on to this model is that there is a demand from advertisers, and that's the advertising demand function here on the right. So this is added to the rest of the framework that I showed you before, right? So once you do these two things, right, for the subscription-based platforms and advertising-driven creator platforms, it turns out with this framework, you can fully compute a closed form equilibrium in which we can tell basically what is the performance of the ecosystem, which producers are in. So that's the K is the collection of producers that choose to produce. And intuitively, these would be the producers whose unit cost of capturing demand on the platform is low. And it's low relative to other producers that they're competing with, right? So in this Kurno game, they're both collaborating to generate value units that bring in customers, but they're competing for a share of the revenue and for attention of these customers. Now, one thing you might find, interesting to note is that the total value units and the value units produced by each producer who joins is related to the average or total cost index, the C1 plus up to CK. And this gives me a really interesting opportunity. And that's not in either of these two papers. But as we start thinking about regulations or even platform design tweaks, for instance, if we were to think about data sharing, right? Or some other useful tools that the platform can provide to complementers. Notice that the Q star can be framed as a function of these Cs. Now, and at the moment in this general model, the Cs follow any arbitrary distribution. It's just a vector. But if I were to impose some useful vectors, such as finite or infinite series that have well understood sums, right? So for instance, if C1 were 1, C2 were half, C3 were 1/4, and so forth, I know exactly what that summation C1 to CK is. And so this would allow us to take interesting abstractions and compute the output in the ecosystem, and then recompute it if some things were changed. It would be fairly straightforward to make those computations. And you can also see that the overall design of the equilibrium is actually quite similar across the two business models I gave you. And that was simply to validate that it works in both of these cases, even though there are some differences in the way these direct versus indirect monetization schemes work. Let me move through these insights pretty quickly. So one key point was to show that the outputs, the joining of producers and how much they produce, the way it depends on the distribution
Hemant,
of the
I'm going to
vector.
ask you to wrap up very quickly.
Very good. Okay, we'll do that. All right. So again, I'm not going to show you results, but tell you what results you can get. And so one key thing is to understand how variations in market structure would affect the equilibrium outcomes. And what I've done here is to resolve the main case where there is a platform, which is the thing in the middle, and producers who are offering value units. But you could have a bilateral monopoly, meaning one producer connecting with the platform. You could have a consortium like Hulu, and you could have vertical monopoly, but also look at things of the platform producing content or products and producers trying to be like a platform and directly selling or direct streaming to customers. And all of these things can be examined by tweaking the model appropriately. And some of these things have been done in the paper. One final slide, Danny, if you don't mind, is to understand what the revenue sharing tensions look like in such platform ecosystems. And the first picture here is from the perspective of the platform, that if it were to choose a revenue sharing parameter gamma, what it gives up to producers, If gamma were very high, then of course it's giving up all its profits to producers, right? And the platform keeps very little. So the platform wants to make gamma lower. But as it gets too low, there is no incentive from producers to offer content or products to the platform. So for the platform itself, there is a moderate level of gamma that seems appropriate. And then we might ask what producers really want. And of course, they would like to have higher and higher revenue share. Uber drivers would love it if 90% of revenue came back to them. But the problem with that is what I mentioned earlier and on the previous slide about changing roles in the market structure. So if gamma were very high and the platform had very low profits, it would then have incentives to become a producer in this ecosystem, right? And again, remember, the platform can also bring in the inputs of production. Perhaps it is not as good. It has a higher CI than some other producers, but very low profits would motivate it to move. And that would be, of course, very threatening to producers. So what this really does is narrow the band of tension between producers and the platform on how to share revenue, right? And from this, you can actually roll that into backward or forward integration and see how it works. So this can also be extended to competition. And I'll just leave you with this final point that, once you bring in platform competition, meaning that let's say if you broke up something like an Amazon into two platforms doing similar things, and you think, well, there's going to be more competition. With this framework can actually be used to explain that, first of all, you would expect prices to be lower to customers, but all producers then would be facing these two separate platform markets that somehow become less efficient overall. And this would certainly lead to lower price for customers, but it would then lead to lower joint profits for the platforms and the producers, but that would then lead to lower contributions from the producers. And that would be an interesting thing to understand, because that may or may not be a good thing depending on what you're looking at. All right. So I will stop here and take some questions, and then we can cover the other two things if there's time.
Okay, great. I think that's super helpful. So I want the virtual hands. And I'm waiting to see on the participants who has virtual hands. While we wait for that, Andre, it turns out you had a question/comment. I'm going to start with you in the meantime. And again, waiting for virtual hands. Don't be shy. By the way, Bobby, if no one else is asking a question, I'm calling on you next. So Andre, we're going to begin with you. You already had a question/comment, which is, in the pure academic context, what everything should be. It's a comment in the form of a question where you had something that you wanted to push back on. Do you want to just work Hemant through that?
Yeah, of course. Let me rephrase it. So I put it as a placeholder. So I think it's useful to think about it. It's not a pushback. It's more to sort of like see how far we can take the interpretation of the model. So, for example, by the way, Hemant, I cringed a little bit when you had on your list of platforms, you had Netflix. Now, again, we might defer. Defer. No, so again, it's fine. Again, it depends how you define it, right? But you see sort of the issue. You see
where I totally understand.
But hold on. So here's the thing. Netflix, I think we can all, it depends how we define platforms. I think we can all agree here that it's not a platform because they control pretty much everything. Now, and I think most subscription platforms, I've looked at Gym Pass, there's ClassPass, there's a bunch of others. I would say a lot of them are going to be like Netflix, so they're more like resellers. Now, there are some, and I'm happy to give you some examples. I've thought quite a bit about this. There are subscription-based, but they're not resellers, so they don't take full control in the sense they do allow, even though they control pricing by definition, right? If you control the pricing through a subscription, obviously that means you're there's a big degree of control, so that makes you less of a platform. But there are some which actually still allow their content providers or their sellers some other things, some freedom, right? So we can still call them platforms to some extent. So I guess my question is, I'm trying to zero in what exactly in the model is specific to platforms, that wouldn't or if it isn't, that's fine too, right? It would mean it's covering both the Netflixes of the world and platforms.
Yeah. So I think you've hit a very good point, and I do agree with you about Netflix not being a platform in terms of control and so forth. Though I do think Gym Pass does qualify because these are gyms that are setting their own prices. But if you happen to join Gym Pass, you get access to all of these gyms, right? So I think that's
they
okay.
control their
But in-
classes. That's a good example.
yeah.
You're right.
But I think in terms of this popular discontent with platforms accumulating too much power, I think the idea still applies to those types of aggregators. And my point was to demonstrate that, yeah, you could still have a model that fits all of them. Now you ask, well, what is really unique to a platform here, right? And I think there is sort of obvious what is and what isn't. Because at the aggregate level, the model captures what I would call cross-network effects on both sides. Demand increases with sellers or what they offer, and sellers' incentive to participate increases with more customers because that leads to more revenue sharing and all that, right? It does not capture micro level or bilateral exchanges. And I felt for the purposes I was building these models, that wasn't quite necessary. In other cases where you do care about those interactions, then appropriate extensions would have to be made. And as you notice, and I did not just speed through it, I do not have a micro model of customer behavior on the platform, though I do have, in a sense, a micro model of complementers, right?
Let me just a quick follow-up. So I agree, and I totally see that. I'm not at all suggesting that you should have the micro-founded model. Now, just to point out, yes, you do have the cross-site network effects, but by the way, Netflix and Walmart, like, they would have the network effects. Like
in this case, yes.
Any retail. So that's why I'm trying to see, again, maybe we can continue this afterwards, but I think there's an interesting point here, because it might be that the issue that you're focusing on applies more broadly. And by the way, Walmart and these other, large retailers have had similar issues. So this issue of accumulated power, I think that particular one may not be unique to platforms. I guess that's what I'm suggesting.
That was partly the motivation, but let me hear from Hannah as well.
Hannah?
So I kind of just to chime in on that. This is kind of a very, very old discussion going back to the 90s, right? The difference between economies of scale and network effects. And I think that here you don't need to differentiate between network effects and economies of scale to get the effect of the power. Right, it's what you are showing is more general, so it doesn't need to be platform. Like Walmart is not a platform, and this kind of this effect, the very basic level, is what Leibniz and like the very early papers in the 90s arguing that not everything that has economies of scale is a network effect, because the more people are using a certain type of shampoo, the more variant, the more types of the shampoo there will be, and therefore you can, more flavors of yogurt and so on. So the question is this just the scale effect, and then it's almost mechanical? The larger is going to have more power, or is there something about platforms per se? And I think I agree with Andrei that I think it's just the scale effect and the increasing returns to scale, whether demand side or cost side, and therefore it may be even more powerful, your model, if you drop the platforms.
Yeah, it's of course it's a marketing issue, and of course the concerns have been around. And given so much of this conversation was about, resentment was about platforms, I agree with you. It's predominantly a scale effect. That and of course we know that with Walmart it would be different here, because unlike Gym Pass, Walmart is actually specifying what it wants its contractors or suppliers to give them, and Gym Pass might leave it more open. But the model doesn't really care about that so much, right? And my colleague Darren just joined. So the other reason I focused on platforms is, some of the inspiration for this work came when I had a lot of conversations with people in industry about how platform ecosystems work, how a platform manager could change what producers did or what enterprise customers did. And those conversations were with, Darren, who was at Atlassian, people at Google Cloud Platform. And there was a common thread coming through about how do we understand these mechanics of the platform, right? And so this is why I chose to present the work in a platform context. I also find it interesting that something I mentioned earlier, if you remember, I said, look, even though I treated market participants and characteristics of producers as exogenous, platforms take a very active role in elements of design that alter those characteristics. So if you think of the vector Cs that I had described for the producers, let's say if this is a YouTube or a TikTok or Instagram kind of platform, the filters, training academies, video editing toolkits, etc., that a platform can offer are crucial to understanding what the C vector would look like and then shape the entire ecosystem performance. Now, of course, Walmart could do that too, right? And when, for instance, to take an example, when they introduced RFIDs, right, that was something that affected all contractors, suppliers to Walmart. But those are not issues that seem to be front and center for those other industries. And so I'm not disagreeing with you, Andre, on the scope and positioning and HANA. But for me, I think clearly that the issues that drove this were in the platform case. And we have a question from Darren.
Well, actually, before Darren, I call on you. We had a comment/question from Ben Kastner. I'm going to just read what he wrote, maybe with a dramatic flair. Can't talk as I'm listening while out on a walk. By the way, we should all take a walk every day. Turns out it's good for you. But when you say breaking up a platform lowers consumer-facing prices, does that necessarily mean an increase in consumer surplus? Or is the change in consumer surplus ambiguous because of the decline in the seller effort?
I do not recall the answer to that. It would actually depend on the more specific shape of the demand function. That is the work in progress part. I have not written the platform competition paper yet, even though I computed the equilibrium. So that's something that I have to look into and then answer. But he's right, there are both of these forces going on, absolutely. So I guess the answer could go either way, depending on various parameters. There's no guarantee to go in one direction.
Great. Now, Darren, your question.
Hey, everyone. So I'm a non-academic here that's in the field. I've managed 3 platforms, 2 as a head of strategy. And what's interesting is I'm in digital ecosystems. The gamma equation is the part that kind of strikes me the most, where I think many times we take it for granted that, say, the app store is at 35% and a 15% renewal, or 25% is the industry average. At Atlassian, it was 25%. And I even made the argument that we should lower it and eliminate it. I'd love to know a little bit more in the gamma calculation. And the teaser as to what I've been working on is in my newest platform, we are actually going to go to a zero marketplace fee. So producers on my marketplace will actually get 100% of the revenue generated through the ecosystem. The way we monetize is subscription of the base product itself. So it's effectively a 3-sided marketplace scenario where the existence of the ecosystem is significantly higher than the product itself.
Thank you for reminding me, Darren. That's something I've always wanted to do formally and add to this, where in my current model, the platform's revenue is entirely from the gamma, the marketplace fee. But if customers also valued a product whose value was increasing with the amount of compliments produced for it, which I have had this conversation for a long time, then that would generate an alternative revenue source. And there is a trade-off between monetizing the complimenters more, but that depresses the compliments, or letting them grow bigger and then taking more on the core product. And that's a trade-off that can easily be examined, right? So absolutely, that's terribly useful. Then if you give me 3 minutes, can I then segue into the revenue sharing topic? As a response to this question?
No. So that's why I think it's gonna be great. And by the way, Darren, thank you for participating. I also really appreciate that you gave the windup. I'm like, I don't think I know who Darren is. But what I want to say is everyone is welcome. And for that matter, if Ben, if you're the person I think you are, aren't you at the FTC in the Bureau of Economics? And if the answer is yes to that, what I really love about this is we have a true community of people in practice, in whether it's government or the private sector. We have academics from across a number of fields. This is exactly what we were hoping for. And unlike Andre, I actually made to put up the background of BU, which is so gracious in hosting this. So Hemant, that was all the way for you to wind up and get back to the right slide, which you're still not on. There we go. Okay.
All right.
Back
So Darren, you talked about reducing the fee all the way to 0. And as I said, that element is something I really want to add and just haven't had the time to do that. But I'll give you a slightly different variation of that, which is, about a year and a half ago or a year ago, Apple and Google both announced a lower tax rate, meaning giving up a greater share of the take for app developers who had revenues up to $1 million, right? So the classic approach was, as you said, with both of them, to offer 30%, keep a 30% tax and then give 70% back to developers, except now they both announced that they would return 85% of the first $1 million. So that's going in that direction of 0 that you mentioned, but not for the same reason. And we were, with my two colleagues, Luna Zhang and Kitty Wang, we were happy to be looking at this topic at the same time. And so we examined this, and it turns out to be a fairly straightforward application of the framework I described to you because of the following result that we proved. So the idea of having now, there's a gamma, which was 70%, and now you have this new rate, which is eta, 85%, or whatever it might be, up to a threshold S, right? So now you get a revenue sharing scheme, which is no longer a linear function, but it's this, with a kink. And turns out it makes the payoff function non-differentiable and so on and so forth. And the question now becomes, how do we take this differential revenue sharing and impose it on top of the model I had built? And we were able to demonstrate that when you have these two different rates, the effect of the second rate can really be thought of as adjusting the C parameters of some developers who pay that lower rate. And so essentially the equilibrium can be obtained by what I show here in this at the bottom, that if I, let's say, have two developer types with cost C1 and C2, C2 being the more high cost per unit, less capable of the small developer, that essentially we can think of their cost as being transformed to C2 times gamma over eta, which is something less than C2, and then recompute the equilibrium from there. And so with that very useful step, we could compute the equilibrium and show that in many cases, what you get is a win-win-win solution for the platform, meaning that giving up 85% rather than 70% leads to more output from the smaller developers. And in some cases, the spillover into more customer demand and then even higher output from the larger producers that still pay 70% or only get 70% can lead to more stuff and higher profits to the platform, right? And so overall, of course, the results, just like the question Ben asked, they can depend on a lot of the other characteristics in the platform. And so that's something we computed out and showed. But basically, the interesting result in this paper was that doing well, giving up, or doing good, giving the small developers a bigger share of revenues actually turns out to be a good thing for the platform in a number of cases.
Excellent. We've been waiting. Bobby, your question.
Danny, can everybody hear me?
We can, and we can actually also see you.
Terrific. So first of all, Andre, Danny, and Hemant, thank you all very much for kicking off this really exciting series. And Danny, when you were mentioning that everyone it was welcome, I felt terrific because I want Hemant to know that he has a young fan. My 4-year-old boy was sitting right next to me and he sat through the entire session. Did not whine, he was paying close attention. He loved all the figures and the graphs. So I was very happy. Now,
that usually works, Bobby. My kids used to be in the background playing with their toys in my room when I was working all the time. So it works. I think whatever we do is very exciting for our kids.
Terrific. So I actually do
Bobby,
have
some parenting advice. The other thing that keeps them quiet is if you give them chocolate during the webinars.
but Danny, this is the East Coast, right? You do realize that it's a little over 9. So that might not be such a great idea.
I take it back. That's right. Don't give kids chocolate after like 7:30 or 8 p.m. Look, we give all kinds of good advice. Some of it is platform, some of it is just scale, some of it is just life advice. But anyway, Bobby, back to your actual question.
Terrific. I have a couple of questions and slash comments. The first comment is that Hemant, I think your work is really inspiring in the sense that you have come up with a very generalized framework with which we can apply into different settings, right? So you have shared with us this flow chart, which nicely broken down the flows of either service or value creation, as well as monetary payoffs, right? Financial compensations. So I think that framework is really nice in the sense that if we want to work on a specific paper, I think we just need to take out a couple of boxes and zoom in on those boxes, and then we can produce really cool papers, right? So that's my first comment, so thank you. My second comment is sort of a comment slash question is in response to both Hemant's characterization of different CIs and Darren's earlier question about, zero gamma, but some sort of a membership fee, right?
No, I think what Darren meant was that, let's say, I'm thinking of Atlassian in particular, and Darren, you can correct me, but Darren, Atlassian has enterprise products that it directly monetizes, but those products become more valuable. And so customers might be willing to pay more for them if there are more integrations, complements, and it leads to better retention because it's harder to get rid of a software product for which you now have 100 other integrations. And that was really the source behind why a zero fee might make sense. So,
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification, because I was thinking of something slightly differently, right? So Hemant, you have done a lot of cool work on nonlinear pricing, right? In a traditional setting. So what I was thinking about, when Darren was asking that question was that, hey, in a platform setting, normally we just take this linear revenue sharing for granted, right? Just because it's easy, it's clean, and sort of matches with reality very nicely, right? But what happens if, things start to get a little more complicated? Once some sort of a base membership fee is charged, right? And then, we build on that, and we might be able to dig out more interesting insights there.
I totally agree with you. And so having a hybrid, so what I explored in this third paper I talked to you about was having 2 fees, the gamma and the eta, but the alternative could be to have a fixed fee to join and then maybe a lower membership. And I think that would be worth exploring. There might be useful applications that fit that. I know Darren has his hand up, so I'm always eager to listen to. I'll let him interrupt me and then I'll carry on.
All right, I just want to share, again, the industry. Salesforce is a great platform to look at. The App Exchange, there's a membership fee to become a developer to build the apps, and then there's the sliding scale. Salesforce is also an interesting product to look at how much they're actually increasing or constraining the fees that they are charging on the developers for this ecosystem that they have. So not only is Salesforce, the product, going up in price, they make it more restrictive to develop new apps in Salesforce. They're effectively in the cost recovery phase of their existence. What I would share is I completely agree on your statement of nonlinear gamma. Atlassian, the last thing I worked on before departing and moving to a different company was we determined it's nonlinear. We knew that from the start. A small new player or producer should be charged a much lower fee as an incentive to join. It's pretty straightforward on the data there. Where it got tricky for us as the platform operator is justifying a flat fee to someone that may account for, say, 15% of the entire revenue of your ecosystem. They have significant bargaining power. And as a platform operator, it starts getting interesting. I either have to go and defend that flat fee, which is what we see with Apple by doing some things that are what you can do with strong bargaining power, or you start considering maybe lowering the fee at top tier, or you introduce other non-monetary features like access to your Salesforce, access to different newer APIs. There's a lot of things we can do to defend it. But I completely agree, taking a non-linear approach, especially if it's not your primary platform income, like mine is, makes more sense.
So Kenny, now if I can take it back from you there. And so,
sorry about that.
This is a very interesting topic, Bobby. Thanks for bringing it up. So first of all, I know in terms of if you talk about the fixed fee, platform theorists have looked at this for a long time and argue that, look, if your goal is to have a very large, vibrant ecosystem, then don't impose a fee because that will restrict entry, which would also be the case with Salesforce. On the other hand, if your customers value a smaller set of high quality complements, or maybe even curated ones, then having the fee can actually help control that quality. So that's another element that would be really worthwhile to think about and then can easily be added in this model. The second thing I want to bring up in response to Darren's point about the 15%, these really big developers, what we looked at in this paper on revenue sharing is almost the entire work on nonlinear pricing is in terms of quantity discounts. The big players get a better deal, right? And this was actually one of the first papers to look at the reverse, which is that the smaller players get a better deal. And not just, to start off, but really that fundamentally the interactions between demand and supply and sort of the scale effects can make it a better outcome for the platform itself.
Great. We have another question. Livia.
Hello. Hi. I don't know if you can hear or see me.
We can both hear you and see you. There's actually somebody else in your screen that's not you as well.
I know. This is actually Livia. I'm Julia. I know I stole your identity there for a second, but it makes more sense to use one tablet, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned in your initial slides that you're also investigating digital addiction. Can you expand on that a little bit and how digital addiction comes into play regarding these frameworks you're developing?
All right. So yeah, thank you, Julia. And I probably will not be able to draw the link between the framework and digital addiction, but it's certainly something I would love to talk about for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So we know, and one of the issues with a lot of these platforms that are based on indirect monetization, that they're reliant on advertising, data, etc., that they have an incentive to create designs that cause addiction. They want you to be on the platform for as long as possible. And this, in terms of design, this could be to the extent that they filter out or fake content, fake news, fake videos, clickbait, watch bait, all of these things that to some extent platforms have a dial that they can set in terms of how much they do things that keep you engaged, even if it's detrimental to you in some way, versus to the extent that they can look after well-being and produce and offer you better quality. So if I think of that as a trade-off, then we know attention-based models are tilting us towards more addictive designs. And then the question becomes, what if a good platform came around, right? So if we're concerned about the way Twitter or Instagram or TikTok are leading to addiction, what if we had other designs that offered, whatever you define as good stuff, filter out bad, sensational, fake, other things? Would that work? And some people have argued in the case of privacy that these same trade-offs have come up. And in fact, the market seems to work, that there are firms that give consumers better treatment of their data in terms of privacy, and they can charge higher prices, and the market settles into some kind of segmentation equilibrium. And so what I wanted to do was look at what happens if you have this good platform that is going to compete with less addictive design and instead charge user fees, right? Would it work? And in particular, what happens if there are network effects that, platforms with more users are going to get an advantage in terms of how they work and get customers and profits. So the way I might think about it is there are now 2 firms, what I call a bad firm and a good firm, right? And customers are also differentiated between how sensitive they are to paying fees, meaning they'd rather take less quality content, more addictive content, because it's there for free. And other customers might be more quality sensitive and therefore veering towards the good firm. And you can think about the time people spend on these platforms as a function of their own taste for quality versus price, and the level of addictiveness of a platform's design. So if you can follow these two curves, there's the blue curve, which is some level of addiction. And then if the platform becomes even more addictive, some people on the right would quit the platform. Their time spent would go to zero. Others on the left may actually increase the amount of time they spend. And if I take this framework and throw it into a model of competition and setting optimal prices and levels of addiction, it turns out that when both firms are competing as information goods, there is a segmenting equilibrium that arises. And one can charge a fee, the other can use ads, and it all works out. But if you add network effects to this, in this model severely handicaps the good firm to the point that market competition really fails to support its place in the market, right? So this is just very early thinking on this idea of addiction and how it plays out in competition between firms of different types that are chasing different designs and in terms of customer satisfaction and the way they monetize. And the news here is that it doesn't bode well for good firms, and therefore we need to change something in the behavior of this market to create some space for firms that might, like the BBC, for instance, if you believe that try to produce better information or social content for users rather than just chase advertising dollars. Right.
Okay, we are very close to the hour. So instead of asking a quick question for which we get a, unfortunately, overly quick answer, Hemant, you've got roughly 2 minutes left. What's next? Sort of what, there are a number of areas of sort of pushing this forward. Where do you need help thinking thematically, and where is it that people can offline follow up with you?
Oh, well, following up on offline is absolutely easy and welcome. Look up my email address if it's not here, but it's hemantb@gmail.com or at ucdavis.edu, or just look for me on Google. I'd love to actually take specific extensions of this framework to ask very specific questions around market constraints and regulations and so forth. And I've been giving this talk, in longer version at, a few universities in the last several months. And during the conversation, several ideas emerged that I have not had either the sense to note down or the time to follow up. But I know these things arise all the time. One interesting one I remember was, since I presented subscription and advertising-based models, which one might be better for a platform under different conditions? And that's, to my mind, fairly straightforward to ask here. Maybe it wasn't the most interesting question to me, but things of that sort, or I think certainly issues around changing the role of different participants, changing the market structure in these industries, and what consequences that would be, and the question I think that Ben asked, would it really ultimately be good for consumers? Would it be good for producers, perhaps, right? And so those are things that, we all can intuitively address in different platform settings. So for instance, for Uber and Lyft, when this issue of gig workers, classification comes up, we know that most producers do not like it, but can we come up with a systematic way to determine what this ecosystem would look like, right? How would it change the number of drivers, how much time they spend, and then other aspects of the ecosystem. So I would love to follow up with anyone interested and take those issues forward.
Great. We're very respectful of the time, which is already 9 p.m. on the US East Coast, 6 p.m. US West Coast, and early in the morning, sometimes getting kids ready for school, sometimes just having gotten rid of them for school, somewhere in Asia. So we want to thank you very much. We want to thank Hemant. We want to thank all of you for the inaugural participation. And actually, I want to give Andre an opportunity to just add something about the next talk. So Andre, I'll let you close us out.
And a big thanks from me to you all.
I will just say thanks everyone for participating. I hope to see even more people at the next session. Oh, by the way, all the talks are listed on the website, which I think, so if you're not on the email list, please email. I think there's an email on the website, so you can get on the email list and you'll get the invitations with the Zoom link and everything for all the talks to follow. And Danny, thank you for setting a very high bar for moderator-led entertainment. I think it'll be. I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone to match that.
Okay. See you all next month. Take care.
All right. See you in a month.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.